There's a cop at my door. Karen is standing behind him, arms crossed, smirking like she'd already won. I took one slow breath and smiled, because she had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. And in about 48 hours, her whole world was going to shift. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you need to understand what this cabin means to me before you can fully appreciate what happened. I didn't inherit money. I didn't win a lottery. I built my career from the ground up. Long hours, early mornings, late nights, for over a decade. And when I finally had enough saved, I did something I dreamed about since I was a kid. I bought a cabin. Not a mansion, not something flashy. A quiet, beautiful piece of property on the edge of a planned community, tucked back in the trees, with a porch I could sit on and finally breathe. It was mine, every single board and beam of it. Now, this community had an HOA. I knew that going in. I read every rule. I followed every guideline. My cabin was well maintained. My yard was clean. And I kept to myself. I wasn't there to make enemies. I was there to decompress after a demanding work week. But here's the thing about certain neighborhoods. Some people aren't satisfied unless they're in control of everyone around them. And one woman in particular had made that her full-time personality.
Her name wasn't actually Karen, but I promise you, the name fits so perfectly that I'm going to use it anyway. And if you've ever lived in an HOA community, you already know exactly the type of person I'm talking about. She was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the woman who memorized the HOA rulebook not to follow it, but to weaponize it. She'd been on the HOA board for 3 consecutive terms, and somewhere along the way she'd confused volunteer board member with absolute authority. She had a gift for spotting problems that weren't really problems. A fence post 2 inches off, a recycling bin left out 1 hour past collection time, a wind chime she personally found disruptive to the community aesthetic. She filed complaints like it was a competitive sport and she was training for the Olympics. Before I ever moved in, I heard stories. My next-door neighbor, a retired school teacher named Dale, warned me over the fence on my very first weekend. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Just keep your head down and don't give her anything to work with." I laughed it off. I'm a professional. I manage people for a living. I've handled difficult personalities in boardrooms and negotiations and high-stakes conversations. I figured I could certainly handle one overzealous HOA volunteer. That was my first mistake, because Karen wasn't just difficult. Karen was strategic, and she had already noticed me. It started small. That's how it always starts, right? About 3 weeks after I moved in, I got my first letter from the HOA. Apparently, my cabin's exterior paint color was, and I'm reading directly from the letter here, inconsistent with the community's approved palette. My cabin was dark brown, like a cabin, in the woods. But according to Karen and the board, the specific shade of brown I'd chosen was not on the approved list. I didn't argue. I reached out, got the approved color guide, and repainted a small section for comparison. The difference was so minimal that 2 separate board members told me privately it wasn't worth pursuing. Case closed, or so I thought. 2 weeks later, another letter. This time it was about my truck. I'd parked it slightly over the invisible boundary line of my own driveway. I moved it 6 inches. Done. Then came the complaint about my porch lights. Apparently they were too bright and causing light pollution for neighboring properties. My neighbor directly across from me told me he'd never noticed my lights once. He had no idea what she was talking about. Each time I responded calmly. Each time I complied with whatever minor adjustment was requested. I documented everything, every letter, every email, every response I sent. Because something in my gut told me this wasn't about paint colors or parking or porch lights. This was about power. Karen had decided that I was going to be her next project, and she wasn't going to stop until I either broke down, fought badly, or packed up and left. She didn't know me very well, because I don't break down, I don't fight badly, and I definitely wasn't leaving my cabin.
Now here's where things took a turn I genuinely didn't see coming, at least not this fast. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October. I had 2 friends visiting for the weekend. We were sitting on the porch, grilling, listening to music at what I would describe as a completely reasonable volume. We weren't loud, we weren't rowdy, we were 3 grown adults eating burgers and watching the sun go down through the trees. At around 6 p.m., I noticed Karen standing at the edge of my property line, not on my property, but right at the edge, watching us, just watching. I waved. She didn't wave back. She turned and walked away. 45 minutes later, there was a police cruiser pulling into my driveway. The officer was professional and polite. I want to be clear about that. He explained that a neighbor had called in a noise complaint. He could clearly hear that the music was not loud. He could see that we were just sitting on a porch. He was almost apologetic about being there. I invited him to come listen for himself. He declined, said it wasn't necessary. He asked me to keep it reasonable for the rest of the evening, which it already was, and I said absolutely, no problem. But here's what I'll never forget. As the officer was walking back to his car, Karen had positioned herself about 30 feet away, watching the whole thing unfold with her arms crossed and that smirk on her face, the same smirk you saw at the very beginning of this video. She wanted me to feel embarrassed. She wanted my friends to feel uncomfortable. She wanted me to know that she had the power to disrupt my peace whenever she felt like it. The officer drove away. My friends looked at me. One of them said, "Man, what is wrong with her?" I shook my head slowly and said, "I honestly don't know, but I think we're about to find out." I had no idea how right I was. Monday morning, back to the real world. I'm a department head at a mid-sized company. I manage a team of about 20 people across 2 divisions. It's a demanding role, but I love it. And Monday mornings usually start the same way. Coffee, emails, a quick scan of my weekly reports. I was about halfway through my inbox when my assistant forwarded me an updated org chart reflecting a recent internal transfer. Someone had moved from another division into one of the teams under my direct supervision. Standard stuff, happens all the time. I almost scrolled past it, but something made me stop. The last name caught my eye. It was the same last name as Karen's, unusual enough that it registered. I sat up a little straighter and clicked on the profile. There was a photo, and I recognized the face immediately, not from work, but from my neighborhood, from my driveway, from 30 feet away, standing next to a woman with her arms crossed and a smirk on her face. Karen's husband now reported directly to me. I sat back in my chair and just stared at the ceiling for a moment. The irony was almost too much to process. This woman had been making my weekends a living nightmare, filing complaints, calling the cops on my porch, and her husband had just landed on my direct team with either of us knowing the connection. I want to be crystal clear about something. I am a professional. What happens in someone's personal life has no place in how I treat them at work. Karen's husband, I'll call him David, was going to be evaluated on his work, full stop. But I'd be lying if I didn't sit there for a solid minute thinking, she has absolutely no idea. While I was sitting with that information quietly at work, Karen was busy at home, escalating. The week after the cop incident, she filed a formal written complaint with the HOA board. Not just a note, a full typed document with bullet points, timestamps, and what she described as a pattern of disruptive behavior. Over a porch grill-out with 2 friends on a Saturday afternoon. She circulated a letter to 6 neighbors asking them to co-sign her complaint. 4 of them told me about it privately and declined. Dale, my retired schoolteacher neighbor, actually called me on the phone to give me a heads up. He said, "She's trying to build a case against you. Just thought you should know." I thanked him and kept documenting. Then she showed up at the next HOA meeting, which I attended because at this point I wasn't going to be invisible anymore, and presented her complaint in front of the entire board. She spoke for 11 minutes. I counted. She used words like pattern, ongoing disruption, and my personal favorite, threat to community cohesion, over a cookout. The board listened politely. A couple of members looked genuinely uncomfortable. When they asked if I wanted to respond, I kept it brief. I presented my documentation, every letter, every response, every timestamp. I was calm, I was organized, I was professional. The board tabled the complaint pending further review, which in HOA language basically means it went nowhere. Karen did not take that well. As the meeting ended and people filtered out, she stopped near me, close enough that I could hear her, and said to another board member, "Some people just don't understand how things work around here." She was about to get a very clear lesson in exactly how things work. 2 weeks after that HOA meeting, Karen came to my cabin. Not with a letter, not through the board. She walked up my driveway on a Wednesday evening, knocked on my front door, and stood there with a folder tucked under her arm like she was about to deliver a verdict. I opened the door. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her and waited. She launched in immediately,
More complaints. Something about a delivery truck that had parked briefly in the street in front of my property. Something about a motion sensor light she claimed had flashed into her cousin's window. Her cousin who was visiting for one weekend and whose opinion on my motion sensor light she apparently felt qualified to represent formally. She talked for a while. I let her finish completely. I didn't interrupt. I didn't cross my arms. I just listened with a calm, neutral expression on my face. And when she was done, I said, "Karen, can I ask you something?" She looked slightly caught off guard. She'd been expecting pushback, not a question. She said, "What?" I said, "Do you know what company your husband David works for?" She blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" I said, "Just curious. Do you know who his department head is?" There was a pause, a long one. I could see her brain working, trying to figure out where I was going. She said his company's name slowly, like a question. I nodded. "That's right. I'm his department head, Karen. David reports directly to me." The folder slipped slightly under her arm. "I've known for about 2 weeks," I said, keeping my voice completely even. "I haven't said a word about any of this to him, because what happens between neighbors has absolutely nothing to do with how I manage my team. That's not how I operate." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "But I did want you to know," I said, "that I know. And I think it's worth us both taking a step back and asking whether this neighborhood situation is really worth continuing the way it has been." She stood there for what felt like a full minute, completely frozen. The smirk was gone. The folder was trembling slightly in her grip. Then she turned around and walked back down my driveway without another word.
I've thought about that moment many times since it happened, and the part that stays with me isn't the satisfaction, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some. It's the completeness of the shift. One moment, she was the most powerful person in that driveway. The next moment, she wasn't, and she knew it, and I knew it, and there was nothing left to say. Dale had been watering his plants across the street. He'd watched the whole thing from start to finish. When Karen disappeared around the corner, he looked over at me, raised one eyebrow, and gave me a single, slow nod. That nod meant everything. The fallout was quieter than I expected, which honestly told me everything I needed to know about Karen. The formal HOA complaint was quietly withdrawn the following week. No explanation, no retraction, just gone, like it had never been filed. The letters stopped, the complaints stopped, the strategic positioning at the edge of my property line stopped. David, her husband, was professional and composed at work, as he had always been. He never mentioned the neighborhood situation. I never brought it up. He was evaluated on his performance, given honest feedback, and treated exactly like every other member of my team, because that's how it should be, and that's how it was. A few neighbors reached out in the weeks that followed, not to gossip, but to quietly say they'd noticed the change in Karen's behavior and were relieved. Apparently, I wasn't the first person she'd targeted. I was just apparently the first one she hadn't been able to outlast. The cabin felt different after that, quieter, more like what it was always supposed to be, mine. I want to be honest with you about something, because this is a storytelling channel, and I think you deserve the real version, not the cleaned up one. When I found out David worked for me, I had a moment, just a moment, where I thought about how easy it would be to make Karen's life very uncomfortable. I had leverage I hadn't asked for and didn't want, and I'll admit, after weeks of letters and cops at my door and HOA meetings and smirks, part of me understood the temptation. But here's what I kept coming back to. The moment you use professional power to settle a personal score, you've become the thing you were fighting against. You've become the person who abuses whatever authority they have to control people around them. And that's exactly what Karen was doing from the beginning. So I didn't touch it. David's career was never part of this, not even close. He's still on my team. He does solid work. He has no idea the full extent of what his wife was doing, as far as I know, and that's between them. What I did do was stand in my own driveway, tell the truth, and let the weight of it land without weaponizing it. That's it. That's the whole play. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a conflict is simply make sure the other person understands that you see everything and then choose not to destroy them with it. That choice, more than anything else, is what ended it. The HOA still exists. The rules still exist. I still follow them, but nobody's filing complaints about my porch lights anymore. And I still sit out there every single weekend, and it is still completely mine.
If you made it to the end of this video, I genuinely appreciate you. These stories aren't always easy to tell, but I share them because I know a lot of you are dealing with your own versions of this. Maybe it's an HOA. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's someone at work who's decided you're their target. And if that's you, here's what I want you to take from this. Document everything. Stay calm in public. Never give them the reaction they're fishing for. And handle yourself with enough integrity that when the moment of truth comes, and it usually does come, you're standing on solid ground. You don't have to be loud to win. You don't have to be cruel. You just have to be consistent, patient, and completely unbothered. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Karen never filed another complaint, never knocked on my door again, never positioned herself at the edge of my property line. The smirk never made another appearance. And every Saturday evening, when I sit on that porch, fire going, music on at a perfectly reasonable volume, I think about how close I came to letting someone else's need for control steal something I'd worked my whole life to build. I didn't let that happen, and neither should you. If you have an HOA horror story or a neighbor situation that went sideways, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Like the video if this resonated, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.